Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan is the most direct example in our readings of a work created in response to traumatic political change. Hobbes's very long life encompassed most of a decades-long revolutionary upheaval in the British Isles. This revolution was itself a sideshow of the 30 Years' War on the European continent, a war that left the continent as ruined as it was in 1945. Hobbes was shaped by these upheavals. Born in 1588, just as the Spanish Armada tried and failed to invade England, Hobbes was educated at Oxford, where, like Machiavelli, he was steeped in Greek and Roman classics, along with the biblical tradition. He worked as the household tutor to the prominent Earl of Devonshire, whose patronage gave him the leisure and status to pursue a wide range of scientific studies. A committed supporter of King Charles I, Hobbes was forced into exile in Paris when civil war broke out between the king and his opponents in Parliament in 1640. In Paris, Hobbes lived in a large community of exiled royalists, who circulated stories of chaos, bloodshed, and disorder across Britain, complete with roving armies of religious fanatics and so-called parliaments of middle-class shopkeepers and farmers. It was in this atmosphere that Hobbes wrote Leviathan. Between 1640 and 1660, England was transformed by revolution. This period of civil war, social upheaval, and political innovation is the first of the modern revolutions, so called because they pitted quasi-medieval, absolutist monarchies against a rising alliance of the urban and rural middle classes. Violent struggles for political power cascaded into social revolution, in which a new social force, a new class, rooted in the commercial and capitalist middle classes, first appeared on the historical scene. The generic academic term for this class is the bourgeoisie, whose control over the capitalist system and the industrial economy ensured their rise to power as the dominant class in modern societies. We associate its seizure of power with a series of revolutions whose outcomes determine the development of the modern world. The English, Dutch, and French revolutions are the classic examples of successful bourgeois revolutions, among dozens of examples in Europe, Latin America, and Asia. In the case of the United States, the American Revolution of 1763 to 1789 expressed deep currents of bourgeois radicalism, and a growing body of scholarship pairs it with the Civil War and Reconstruction from 1860 to 1877 as another period of bourgeois revolution that established the supremacy of free labor capitalism. But back to the original case, the English Revolution. In 1640, the absolutist regime of King Charles I came to blows with Parliament, the kingdom's assembly of notables that, uniquely at the time, limited the king's ability to tax his subjects. Charles tried to emulate his fellow monarchs in France and Spain, who exercised complete authority over governments with increasingly robust powers to extract wealth from society. But royal power in England, by comparison, had always been weaker than it was on the continent, and Charles' belligerent efforts to build an absolutist state in which his word would be law ran into ferocious opposition by new forces in Parliament. These middle-class, commercially oriented members of Parliament were primarily Puritans, whose opposition to Charles' absolutism was expressed as resistance to his religious claim that as head of the Church of England he was ordained by God to rule his subjects. The English Puritans were austere, radical Protestants who resisted the authority of the English church hierarchy. Since the church was a part of the state, resistance was tantamount to treason. Intense state persecution led some of the most militant Puritans to flee the country, first to Amsterdam, and then to Plymouth and New England, where Puritanism would become a foundational element of American culture. A religion of aspirational strivers from the middling classes, Puritanism gave Charles' opponents an ideological cohesion that allowed them to organize an armed challenge to the monarchy. Years of civil war convulsed England, Scotland, and Parliament, and at the close of the first period of struggle, Charles was captured by the victorious parliamentary forces. The revolutionary New Model Army, commanded by Puritan hardliners and full of soldiers with radical democratic ideas, became the real power in England. It was based on the army's strength that parliamentary leaders led by General Oliver Cromwell proceeded to convict Charles for treason and then behead him. Now, Nothing marks a modern revolution quite like the killing of a king, and Charles' death set off another round of warfare, in which the English Commonwealth, a Puritan military dictatorship, fought to secure its rule against rebellion and invasion. Meanwhile, the fall of the monarchy set off a period of intense cultural activity that generated a host of new radical Puritan sects and a flood of sectarian literature, establishing the first standards for freedom of speech and freedom of the press as logical outcomes of the freedom of religious conscience that the revolution had established. This cultural revolution would prove to be one of the most enduring changes of this period, and contributed mightily to slowly emerging concepts of liberalism. But in political terms, the revolutionary experiment ground to a halt in 1660, following the death of Cromwell, a mutiny in the army, and finally the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II, son of the beheaded king. A further revolution in 1688, again a mass effort led by Parliament to curb an absolutist king, created the basic outlines of the modern British state, in which Parliament is supreme and the monarchy's role is mainly symbolic. Some scholars have called Leviathan the only true masterpiece of political thought in the English language. This is certainly debatable, but Leviathan is a crucial work for understanding the opening stages of the intellectual and social revolutions that brought European civilization out of the Renaissance and into early modernity. Hobbes' interest here is not just political. For Hobbes, his political philosophy develops necessarily out of his more fundamental philosophy of the nature of the universe and humanity's place in it. Hobbes was a convinced materialist. This means that, for Hobbes, every fact about the world and human experience can be explained and understood in terms of some physical cause. In contrast to a tradition that began with Plato's idealism, materialism does not endorse the existence of a separate realm of the mind that exists apart from the material world we all live in every day. The ideas we have about God, fate, love, and all other abstractions can ultimately be reduced to some physical action in the world. Hobbes was a devoted champion of the scientific revolution then sweeping through European thought. This fundamental intellectual transformation was, along with the Industrial Revolution, the most decisive factor in shaping the attitudes and values of modernity. In Hobbes' lifetime, though, the scientific view of the world was still an insurgent and sometimes dangerous point of view to hold, and indeed, Leviathan in Britain was banned for alleged blasphemy. What was blasphemous in Hobbes' philosophy was very much like what was seen to be blasphemous in Isaac Newton's theories of physics. For Newton, the universe is a material structure governed by natural laws uncovered through scientific investigation. It is not a single creation that manifests the power and goodness of God. Instead, the universe is a gigantic machine, and in principle, anyone can run a machine once they familiarize themselves with all of its parts. In this sense, science is really about acquiring the knowledge necessary to master and manipulate nature. Hobbes thinks human beings and human societies operate on the same basis. Everything humans do is determined by the fact that they live in a mechanical universe governed by laws. There are no exceptions to these laws, just as there are no exceptions to the law of gravity. Humans necessarily develop certain traits and behaviors as a consequence of obeying these laws. From simple natural laws comes an increasingly complex reality, as the pressure of necessity compels humans to invent their own laws to preserve them from the cruel and unappeasable fate of life in the state of nature. I want to pause here and point out an important piece of context before we dive into the core argument of Leviathan. Hobbes is often portrayed, for good reason, as a proponent of absolutist politics, in which all power and authority are held by a single ruler who exercises total control over his subjects. This might seem to be the farthest thing imaginable from our assumptions about political liberalism, limited government, and civil rights. And yet, Hobbes can be claimed as one of the founders of the liberal political tradition that, mediated through the works of John Locke, inspired the political theory of the American revolutionaries. This view holds that Hobbes' entire line of thought begins from a revolutionary but subtle premise. In the preface to Leviathan, Hobbes says that his view of politics is logically airtight, and the reader will find this to be so because Hobbes's argument is geared toward passions and impulses that every single human being possesses. That is, Hobbes says you will know his argument to be true because it is the logical conclusion to coping with the emotions that drive us all. Now, this is a strange claim, but what's important about it is that it takes for granted that all people share the same basic drives. No matter their status or station in life, no matter where they live or what they believe, human beings are all equal in the passions that animate them. For instance, all humans are equal in their vulnerability to the terrible fate of violent death, and thus all are driven by the same fear, which, no matter its subjective cause, feels the same in every case. So, in his own strange but crucial way, Hobbes insists on the tangible reality of human equality, based on the overwhelming sameness of our core motivations. Now, back to Hobbes's core argument. Our first interest is in what Hobbes calls manners. By this, he means the qualities and practices that arrive from managing the human need to live and work together, a need that in turn arises from the absolutely imperative human drive to avoid a violent, painful death. Hobbes stakes a lot on this claim about the all-important, motivating fear of dying horribly. The centrality of this fear goes a long way to explaining why humans often tolerate bad or cruel government, because it beats the alternative. We tolerate the necessity of living with others, a way of life that interferes with our primal, solitary freedom, because it lowers the chances of violent death. Lowers, but does not eliminate. Hobbes says all human history begins in a state of nature, a remorseless world determined by a few universal facts of human life. The first is that human beings, before they are anything else, are desiring creatures. In an important sense, we are the sum total of our cravings and our longings, and our entire lives are shaped by the ways in which we pursue a never-ending chain of desires, a constant state of wanting that ends only in death. Second, in this original state of nature, without society or culture, human beings are absolutely free and absolutely equal. Free because we can do whatever we want without restraint until stopped by a stronger force. Equal because we all share the same drives and we are all vulnerable to sudden, violent death. Third, since we are equal in our desires and free to pursue them at will, we will compulsively do so unless forcibly prevented. From this natural impulse comes the war of all against all, the defining quality of the state of nature. Our relentless need to satisfy our desires in conditions of equality necessarily leads to conflict. In a zero-sum fight for scarce resources, everyone will distrust the motives and intentions of everyone else. Distrust breeds insecurity, as individuals vainly seek safety that they can't provide on their own. Insecurity breeds violence, as people use every tool at their disposal to pursue wealth, security, or reputation. Violence creates a state of war, since there is now a general expectation of the use of force, and no mechanism for restraining it. So, the strong will violently dominate the weak, though the weak may temporarily band together to murder their tormentors. This is a state of war in which no one can ever truly be safe, no one can ever trust anyone else, and no meaningful form of human life is possible. Fourth, since humans in this state are driven by a desire for ease and comfort, most will willingly surrender their freedom to whatever power is strong enough to defend them in their comfort. The intolerable pressure of the state of nature demands a solution, and since nature itself provides no solution, humans have to rely on their own abilities to overcome the war of all against all. These abilities are governed by a small set of laws that arise from the needs of humans in the state of nature. Because the most profound desire is the will to keep on living, people in this state have an absolute right to defend their lives by any means necessary. No one has the right to take their own life. No one has the right to take their own life or to destroy the resources that are needed to maintain life. Faced with the intense pressure of these conditions, humans create an entirely new institution capable of overcoming the state of nature. This institution is the Commonwealth, though we would probably use the word government, but Hobbes calls it Leviathan. To exit the state of nature, a group of individuals come together and make a solemn covenant in which each member surrenders an equal share of their primal freedom to govern themselves and their right to kill in self-defense and hands that power to a sovereign. This sovereign can be an individual, like a king, or it could be a group, like a parliament or a congress. In either case, what matters is that the sovereign has absolute power to make laws binding for all members of the Commonwealth, and he retains the sole authority to use violence. The sovereign's subjects have surrendered total freedom for security, but in doing so, they voluntarily endowed the sovereign with that total freedom. So long as Leviathan maintains security, the sovereign's rule is law and it cannot be appealed. Leviathan's godlike nature is most directly expressed in the sense of awe that it evokes from its subjects. For Hobbes, the passions whose free reign leads to the state of nature never vanish. The Commonwealth can only suppress their expression. To suppress a powerful force requires, naturally, the application of a superior force. Thus, Leviathan must be the undisputed wielder of violence in order to suppress violence. All power is concentrated in Leviathan so that no one else will dare challenge its authority by asserting their own power. Think of Machiavelli's claim that while a ruler can be loved or feared, it is ultimately safer to be feared. Hobbes might say that Leviathan can keep its subjects in terror or in awe, but it is ultimately safer to keep them in awe. By awe, I mean a feeling usually associated with religious reverence for the divine, a sense that one is in the presence of an unappeasable power whose sheer size compels obedience. The purpose of the Commonwealth is to keep order by any means necessary, and while the fear inspired by terror may sometimes be necessary, the fear inspired by awe is preferable. This kind of fear encourages voluntary submission and a sense of obligation, encouraged by a mixture of sincere belief and a dread of punishment. In the long run, for both Machiavelli and Hobbes, this kind of constructive fear is preferable to the destructive fear created by violent repression. Only by concentrating power in this dramatic way can a realm of order exist outside of the state of nature, an order that makes possible all other forms of human society and human development because it guarantees the safety of its members against violence. This is why Hobbes calls the Leviathan a mortal god. Mortal because it is a human creation within history, and God because, well, the Commonwealth provides safety and community on condition of obedience, a dynamic that is recognizable to anyone familiar with the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions that Hobbes was familiar with. We are far away from Aristotle's vision of the good life. The Leviathan is not a telos. It is not some natural end toward which humans strive. It is a harsh necessity demanded by the logic of life in the state of nature. For Hobbes, there is no good life or a particular human destiny. There is only the material world and the strategies necessary for surviving in it. Hobbes' revolutionary vision of politics is the earliest example of the social contract tradition in Western political thought. To most Americans, the social contract is familiar as an idea of John Locke's that found its way into the Declaration of Independence, which takes for granted the idea that governments derive their power from the consent of the people they govern, and that government has obligations toward its citizens, just as citizens have obligations to their government. Locke's vision of the social contract is milder than Hobbes, and the French variant of the tradition, which we'll examine when we read Rousseau, argues for a social contract that encourages democracy rather than absolutism. Finally, what is Hobbes talking about when he calls the Commonwealth Leviathan? It's an odd, uncanny word that complements the disturbing quality of the famous cover illustration that Hobbes commissioned for the first edition of Leviathan. The foreground depicts a city landscape and a lush countryside. Looming over this is a monstrous creature. The creature takes the form of a king with sword and scepter, but the king's body is made up of a multitude of human forms, pressed together into one gigantic body. This is a literal depiction of the body politic, a medieval notion that conceived of the people of a country as members of one metaphorical body, in which the king might be the head, the farmers the hands, and so on. This actually derives from the ancient concept of the Christian church as the body of Christ, in which all believers make up, as it were, the divine shape. But it's also a monstrous, terrifying creature, a looming giant capable of using tremendous violence. This is where the word Leviathan comes in. The word itself is Hebrew and refers to a giant sea monster referenced in the Bible and that is common to many Semitic mythologies. In these same mythologies, the Leviathan is also a representation of the primal chaos that existed at the beginning of time, when God slaughtered the Leviathan in battle and made the universe out of his corpse. The Leviathan also appears in Herman Melville's Moby Dick, where the white whale obsessively hunted by Ahab and the Pequod is repeatedly identified with this primal beast. The white whale is identified with Leviathan because both are expressions of power beyond human imagination, a force that defies our understanding. I'll take a minute here to also suggest to folks that if you find yourself with some extra time in need of something to read, by all means, please read Moby Dick. It is probably one of the supreme works of art created in America, and it has more to say about the nature of American life and the structure of the American imagination than almost any other book could. So please, by all means, get yourselves a copy of it, read it, you won't regret it. But to close up, it may be that the Leviathan is a metaphor for the transition out of nature and into society. It may also signal a note of ambivalence about the harsh means by which humans escape the state of nature. An absolutist government might be necessary to establish order, but what happens when that government turns its violence inward against its own people? What happens when the body politic begins to fall apart? And what happens when the great beast rises out of the sea?